Hi there. I'm going to examine briefly here Jason Decosta's video he posted today. It's called There Was Nothing New About the New Testament Mission. Now, for a little background and context to what I want to focus on in this video that Jason put up, if you go and see that he did a few videos roasting me in my position, you'll see about Joe Dirt, whatever. So he lampooned my idea that there were two phases of the gospel mission to the Gentiles, to the nations. One pre-AD 70, which was the primary purpose was gathering the lost tribes of Jacob that were melted into the nations 700 years prior. And then the second stage, which is being a light and salvation to the nations, to the very ends of the earth. Jason lampooned that. Well, come to find out, I don't know, he claims he's had this for a couple months now, but he's got two gospel things going on to the nations to find Israel, to bring back Israel into the land. There were two gospel missions. All right, so that's pretty ironic, but I want you to hear it directly from him. So I'm going to kind of do right now what he likes to do is play clips, and we'll comment on them. Here's the first one.
But the ones that, have the most meat are those, those ones there in Hosea 2. And they all talk about this time when these Israelites would be coming back to Jerusalem. They would.
All right, let me stop right there. So what Jason is going to do is he's going to talk about the promises that are all throughout the prophets about regathering all Israel. The house of Jacob, or the house of Judah and the house of Ephraim, all the lost tribes of Israel from everywhere where they've been scattered, okay? So he's going to say that somehow that was the prophets, when they were talking about that, they were prophesying the return of the house of Judah, the Jews, during at the end of their captivity in Babylon, to Palestine to rebuild the second temple. All right, first of all, Jason has now clearly said that he doesn't believe the Bible is literally true, that it's all made up, it's all a story. So what gives Jason the authority or the conviction to say what some prophet believed? Like how does he know that Isaiah meant this particular event fulfilled or some other event? How does he know? How he doesn't believe that the story is even true. So anyway, my point here is that the return of the Jews during Ezra and Nehemiah, and that culminated in the Jews coming back so that they were there during the time of Christ. That was not the regathering of the lost tribes. That's not what the prophets were talking about. How do I know that? Because it didn't happen. It did not happen. The prophets knew who was in Babylon. It was the house of Judah. It wasn't the lost tribes. So when the prophets are saying, I'm going to gather you from everywhere that I've sent you, and he lists off all these areas in the world that has nothing to do, is nowhere near Babylon. The prophets are not stupid. They knew God had shown them, because second Isaiah said, he's saying, come out of Babylon, come out of Chaldea. Somehow he knew must have been God's revealing it to him that the Jews were going to be in captivity to Babylon. So the prophets knew. Jason doesn't believe that the prophets had any kind of divine foresight or knowledge, but they clearly knew. They knew their history. They knew that the house of Ephraim had been scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire, and they were, lost into the nations. They it wasn't like they knew exactly where they were, like they knew that the Jews were in Babylon. So, additionally, no one, even contemporaries in the first century of first century Jews in the Second Temple before it was destroyed, they all never betrayed that the tribes have been gathered yet. They all expected that that was still an eschatological thing that needed to be fulfilled. In fact, Josephus himself said that the lost tribes are all an immense multitude beyond the Sambatyon River, which was sort of like a mythological river. And he said that they're in numbers that cannot even be counted. And so the prophets did not describe what happened in the return from Babylon of the house of Judah. No one ever drew the conclusion that that was the fulfillment. And now Jason Decosta says that that's what it was. Now, let's listen to him further, and hopefully we can get to his version of his own two-gospel mission. Okay, here we go.
Come back, the cities would be rebuilt, the land would be restored, there would be blessing in Jerusalem again, and joy in the people. God would call back his people from all nations and places where they went, where they were scattered. It says in the prophets, God would seek them out from all their dwelling places in the farthest parts of the earth, and he would bring them back, right?
That's clearly not the return to Judah from Babylon, by the way. That's clearly not. All right?
He would set up a banner for the outcasts of Israel. He would shine a light to the nations, proclaiming that God had saved his people, Jacob. You know, and this is exactly what took place. Excuse me. In that second temple return to Zion, right? Ezra and Nehemiah, you see these sort of evangelists.
So Ezra and Nehemiah preached the gospel and regathered the lost tribes of Israel. Jason, how about citing some scripture to show us about this this regathering of the lost tribes of Ephraim? Interesting.
It's going out and bringing the people back. They're gathering the lost sheep in. Just the same exact terminology. Everything is basically played out in that old Second Temple period as they return to Zion in waves.
Only they're only the ones that are in Judah or in Babylon, which is just 1 or 2/12 of all Israel.
And all the prophetic language that the prophets use. It's basically a gospel mission for Israel.
It's literally a gospel mission for Israel. And I love his phrase, the gospel mission. That is literally the exact phrase that I've been using, that Jason has been roasting, and now all of a sudden he adopted it. It's interesting. I'm more influential than I thought. All right, so Jason is saying Ezra and Nehemiah were the first ones to bring the first gospel to the nations. Here we go.
You know, it's a mission that went out to the nations to seek the people to bring.
So Ezra and Nehemiah went out to the nations, huh? Where is this? Where is this?
Them back. The prophets talk about how the nations would carry the Israelites back on their shoulders. You know, just exalting them high above.
Yeah. There's imagery in Isaiah about the Gentiles kings bringing the children of Israel in. It says that they're even nursing them at their breasts as they're bringing them in. Jason, the question for you is, when they get to Zion and they've nursed these Israelite babes at their breasts, metaphorically speaking, what do? Do they just stop short of the gates of the New Jerusalem, drop off Israel, and then into the lake of fire because they're pagans? All right.
All the nations, and God would call his people back and have mercy on his people, and they would come with weeping and supplication, and they would again dwell in the land, and the law would.
All right, I'm gonna fast forward to 10:8 because this is the next mention.
You know, word would have spread pretty quickly in the ancient world that Jerusalem was back, it was up and running, the temple was being.
Word would have spread really quickly among the lost tribes of Israel who, all of a sudden now, Jason's going to paint a picture that the lost tribes came back sometime after the Jews came back from Persia. And word would have spread. We don't have any gospel accounts or historical record. There are no historical records about these lost tribes of Israel. They went into the nations and they never came back. And now, what's interesting, where is this logic going? Because if they went out and got the lost tribes of Israel, who was being gathered in the first century. If this was the fulfillment of the prophets that they were talking about, they wouldn't have missed any. They would have brought them all in. This is ridiculous.
Being rebuilt again, this glorious work, this glorious, piece of architecture was going back up, and the people were coming back, and there was joy in the land, and the old man and the young man would celebrate in the streets, and the tambourines would be playing in the streets, and the voice of lamentation would...
Only that's a totally different picture that we get from the post-exilic. Read Haggai and Zechariah. They had to jump in there and prophesy because they weren't getting the job done. They were so focused on building their own houses. They were not rebuilding the temple. God had to send Haggai and Zechariah to encourage them and rebuke them and say, let's build, let's build. And then you get to the last book, Malachi, where things are so bad. Things are so bad. He's rebuking the priest. He's saying, you better watch out, because I'm sending my prophet Elijah, I'm sending my messenger Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord to try to turn back the curse that's coming. All right, let's go to 1408. That was the next spot I want to listen to. Got to hurry up here. Got to hurry up. Let's start here.
The sheep of Israel. So, isn't it just perfect that you have sort of a first gospel mission going out to the nations in the Old Testament to gather Israel back from all the places where they were, and that's referred to by the prophets a million times as my salvation going to the ends of the earth?
We have a first gospel before we have a first gospel of the missions before the one that we all read about in the pages of the New Testament. So we have two gospel missions. Oh my gosh, Jason. Now I'm like totally confused because you roasted my view of the two phases of the gospel mission of the nations, but now you have yours. And what it is you have two gospel missions to retrieve Israel because somehow God didn't do too well on the first one and didn't gather all the ones that were there, so they had to send a second round. This gets really bizarre, by the way, when he says that the first one was a type and the next one was the antitype. He's literally saying the same exact thing, which in view is the gospel outreach to the nations, recapture all Israel. He's saying that's the same exact thing in the type and the antitype. How can that be? How can you have the type and the antitype, which are exactly the same thing? That's bizarre. Because, like, take for an example, the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, that's a type of baptism. The first Christians under, Paul talked about that as baptism. They're going through the waters of baptism in the New Testament. Those are different things, so it can be type and antitype. But you're saying here, gospel mission of the Gentiles, gospel mission of the Gentiles, same thing. One is the type of an antitype, but they're same exact thing. I'm lost. All right, here we go. Let's fast forward to 1700 to get more on that type and antitype. And then we'll wrap this up.
Coming back from the nations, especially since Jesus said he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So I just wanted to call some attention to that because I think it's a very important point to establish. People can argue all they want about those Old Testament prophets, but man, when it says repeatedly that I will bring you back from the hand of the Chaldeans, and I will take you into your land and into your borders again, and I will
not all
establish
Israel
you again and divide the land again to the 12 tribes of Israel. We have to understand when that was, right? When did that take place? Well, there's only one place.
It didn't happen prior to the apostles. That was just the house of Judah from Babylon.
Place in history that ever took place, and it's the return to Zion, Second Temple period, when the temple was rebuilt, the people came back. And
all right, if that's what it was, why was there a need for another one, Jason?
It was wealth, health, prosperity, and blessing again in the land and on the people. Okay, and that's what all the prophets speak of. The majority of the Old Testament is all about that time. Okay, and so what happens is when you come to the New Testament, you see these guys sort of referring back to these old promises, right? Well, these are Israelites who are using their old scriptures, right? The things that they had, they're using them, the prophetic texts, And they're referring back to them to convey the realization and to make sure people understood, or make sure their audience understood, that what's taking place in the here and now, in other words, in those last days, is exactly similar to what took place back then.
All right, hold on. Jason is too dense to realize that his argument has destroyed his own Israel only, because now all Israel, according to him, the prophets, were fulfilled in the return to Zion from Babylon prior to Christ. So why would they think that they have to go back out and get Israel if they already came in? Oh my God. All right. I don't know if there's anything else left here that I want to highlight.
Excuse me.
Well, there's a cough there. He coughed. All right.
God was calling back Israel from the nations, just like Jesus commissioned them. Seek my elect.
They already came in, Jason.
Take this gospel of the kingdom to all nations, and then the end will come.
Okay.
They were seeking the elect. Revelation 5 says that you had called us out of every nation, tribe, tongue, and kindred. Called them out of. They were in the nations. They were being called out.
Why are they there if they were already brought back prior to Christ?
You know, sometimes I wonder, like, I've also toiled with the idea that the New Testament is basically just a sort of a more in-depth, elaborately created look into Ezra and Nehemiah's mission out to the nations to gather in the Israelites, right? Like you have in the Old Testament. You know,
all right, I got to stop that. Okay. All right, let me just end here. I want to also say that though Jason lampooned my two phases of the gospel mission to the Gentiles, he doesn't understand it. He keeps commenting in my YouTubes, and he mischaracterizes it. He doesn't know my argument. All right, but that's for another video, and I'm also writing a book. It'll all be in the book, and I'll try to be sure to include the objections that Jason raises, because he's performing a service for me there. But let's go to Isaiah 49, because this I'm going to read this plus another passage later on. These are foundational to show you. This is at the core of my argument. I agree with I.O. that the purpose of the apostolic mission to the nations, the primary purpose, was to fulfill promises that he would regather Israel that had become Gentiles. Okay? I agree with that. All right? Now, Paul and Peter showed how the incoming of the Gentiles under their ministry was fulfilling Hosea 1 and 2. So the Gentiles that were coming in prior to AD 70 were the lost tribes of Jacob. Okay? Now let's read Isaiah 49. It is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. So what we see here is that it's vitally important to understand that the prophets in the Old Testament did not see the light and salvation to the Gentiles and the regathering of lost tribes as one, as we see in the New Testament. They saw them as two distinct things. So that when the tribes are gathered, that's different than what we read here. I will also give you a light to the Gentiles. There's no other way to read it. That is clear. The way Isaiah, if you try to collapse those two, then the verse basically means nothing. You've totally destroyed the meaning. Now, what we see in the New Testament is the particular Gentiles that Peter and Paul are reaching are actually the lost tribes of Jacob. So that's what their mission is the first part of this. It is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob. So that's what they were doing. That means after they're resurrected and the old covenant is over and the new Jerusalem has been formed and is up and functioning, guess what hasn't been done yet? The Messiah has not been given as a light and salvation to the Gentiles per Isaiah 49:6. That hasn't happened yet, because You, again, from the Old Testament perspective, you cannot combine these two into one. They're two different things. Whereas from Paul's view, when the particular Gentiles he was bringing in, that was only fulfilling part of what Isaiah was talking about here. So what I'm trying to tell, and he ain't listening, and he's going to dance around it, Israel only requires a continuation of the gospel past AD 70 to the very ends of the globe. Okay? Now, I want to look at one last scripture in Isaiah 56. And then we'll end here. This is where he says, I will bring joy to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Of course, their burnt offerings or sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. That wasn't fulfilled in the return to Zion prior to Christ, because Christ quoted this and he rebuked the ones who would return from Babylon. In fact, John later on calls Jerusalem Babylon. So they never really returned.